Is it back to the brink for the Korean peninsula? Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate. Last week's blowing up of a liaison office north of the demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea was just the beginning, warns Pyongyang's ruling Workers' Party newspaper, Rodong Sinmun. Now, even before fury was sparked by North Korean defectors sending leaflets by balloon over the border, tensions had started to rise. Why? Is it all over for the diplomacy that brought Kim's sister to the Olympics in 2018? And a U.S. president who, for the first time, sat down not once, not twice, but 3 times with a North Korean leader. While Donald Trump focuses on his own re-election bid at home and the flack from that memoir by his former national security advisor, John Bolton, who, by the way, accuses Trump and South Korea's president of badly mishandling Kim Jong-Un, ordinary citizens on both sides of the DMZ are wondering what is next. This coming Thursday marks the 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War, one that split the peninsula in two, a reminder that there is still officially a state of war, that 23,000 U.S. troops are permanently based south of the 38th parallel, and that it's always hard to read what's happening inside one of the world's most reclusive regimes. It's one where rumors have swirled since the beginning of the COVID outbreak back in April, when for several weeks, the 30-something leader of North Korea was missing from public view. Who is calling the shots these days in Pyongyang? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at that rising tension in North Korea. And with us to talk about it, France 24 reporter Jaein Lee. Thanks for joining us.
Hiya.
Joining us from Washington, D.C., Harry Kazianis, Senior Director in Korean Studies at the Center for the National Interest. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
From London, Ramon Pacheco-Pardo, Associate Professor at King's College London, the author of North Korea-U.S. Relations from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. Let's start with the latest word out of Pyongyang this Monday that they've started preparing for massive leaflet drops, tit for tat, they say. 12 million pamphlets being prepared for airdrop by balloon. That's sparking tension. Jaein Lee, you reported a week ago on what sparked this latest spike.
Reduced to rubble at around 2:50 p.m. local time. As promised, Pyongyang has destroyed Kaesong's inter-Korean liaison office. The official reason, defectors sending anti-North Korea propaganda across the border.
쓰레기들과 이를 묵인한 자들의 죄값을 깨끗이 받아내야 한다는 격노한 민심에 부응하여 북남 공동연락사무소가 비참하게 파괴됐습니다.
Sending cross-border messages is nothing new, but earlier this month, Pyongyang took a more critical stance on the practice, saying it violates the 2018 Panmunjom Declaration. For Seoul, it's the blowing up of the office that violates the deal.
남북 관계의 발전과 한반도 평화 정착을 바라는 모든 이들의 기대를 저버린 행위임.
2018 saw a rapid détente between the two Koreas, with progressive President Moon Jae-in spearheading talks with his rival Chairman Kim Jong-un and playing mediator between the North and the United States. 2 years have passed and talks have now stalled between Washington and Pyongyang, and in turn, ties have become increasingly frosty between Pyongyang and Seoul. The Kaesong liaison office was a symbol of improved ties between the two Koreas. Its destruction comes as a part of North Korea's announced plans to cut off all communication channels with its rival. Last week, Kim Jong-un's powerful sister Kim Yo Jong also threatened to move the army back into the DMZ, a buffer zone around the border that cuts the peninsula into two.
Jaein Lee, you filed that report last week. Since then, the tension has continued to rise. First off, these pamphlets, why do they matter so much?
Well, to be honest, I think it's nothing new. Like I said in the report, defector groups in South Korea have been sending these pamphlets over to North Korea. Essentially, it's anti-North Korean messages. Sometimes they're accompanied with USB sticks with Korean news in it or Korean TV on it. It's a provocation for North Korea. For Pyongyang, it's definitely seen as a provocation because it's information that they don't want trickling into their country, trickling in. On the other hand, when Pyongyang says it's going to retaliate by doing the same measures, I don't really expect South Koreans south of the border to worry about the messages because it's clearly North Korean propaganda. It does, however, frustrate people who live south of the border, whether it's to send pamphlets to the north or whether it's pamphlets coming from the north, people who live in that area, which is not very far from the capital, Seoul. It's a source of tension. It's very worrying for them every time there's an uptick in tension. And it's also a problem of littering. Sometimes those pamphlets, they don't even make it across the border. They just fall down on the floor, and it's just more environmental littering for them.
And is Kim Yo Jong serious about sending troops into the demilitarized zone?
I think it's possible in the sense where it's the part of the Panmunjom Declaration in 2018 that they decided to pull out. I think they destroyed around 20 guard posts along the DMZ, and it was an effort to show that they're going to stop hostile acts between the two countries. It does go to show that whatever Moon Jae-in achieved in the past 2 years, he had hoped for irreversible acts of peace, and it's becoming more and more clear that what he achieved was actually reversible.
Reversible, completely reversible, Harry Kazianis?
It is completely irreversible, unfortunately. I mean, look, what the Moon government tried to do, I think, was very brave, very bold. And I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., and I can't think of many politicians who would go as far as Moon Jae-in tried to go. I mean, he essentially staked his whole presidency on trying to get some sort of inter-Korean détente. And I think he did the very best he could with the conditions he was under. I mean, I think we have to keep in mind, Moon Jae-in has sort of two things he has to balance at the same time. On the one hand, he can't probably go as far as he wants to go because he has to keep the United States happy. He cannot break international sanctions. Not to say he would do that, but I think he would go as far as he possibly could to try to bring the North Koreans in. On the other hand, speaking of the North Koreans are very upset at Moon Jae-in because he will not break sanctions, because he will not break with the United States. So for Moon, this has always been a very difficult balancing act to sort of maneuver around. And right now, the North Koreans, spiking up tensions, essentially blowing up inter-Korean diplomacy, there's really very little he can do to bring things back unless the North Koreans want to be cooperative. And I just don't see that happening. And
why now? Why the spike at this particular moment?
Well, I think there's two things. I think the first thing is the North Korean economy is probably in tatters. I mean, it was in recession for multiple years thanks to the maximum pressure campaign put by the international community. So I think that's a big part of it. The economy wasn't strong. But when you lock the country down so severely as the Kim regime did due to coronavirus, obviously that made things even worse. So with the economy in tatters, and also in a unique time here in Washington with the US presidential election, I think for the Kim regime, they're always very good at selectively dialing up the pressure when they want to. Now, it's difficult to know what they might do next. There's a lot of things they can do, but you have to admit the timing. It's if you want to sort of get the maximum impact, this is the time to do it.
So, Ramon Pacheco Pardo, which is it? Is this attention-seeking behavior saying to Washington and Seoul, hey, you've forgotten about us? Or is it those domestic issues, the fact that the economy is reeling in North Korea that you heard Harry mention, that are the factor of why this tension is suddenly rising?
In my view, on this particular occasion, it seems that the domestic reasons are more important. Not that the others don't matter, but what we see is that Kim Jong has failed. He wanted sanctions relief, and for whatever reason, he hasn't gotten sanctions relief 2 years after he met with President Trump in Singapore. And as Harry was saying, what we have seen is that the North Korean economy has been nosediving over the past few months. Since the COVID-19 started to hit North Korea and the rest of the world, we have seen how the border with China has closed. There is no trade going on. There is no investment obviously going into North Korea. Even aid is drying up. So the North Korean economy surely is not doing very well. I do think that for North Korea, it is important to note as well that they cannot directly pressure the United States in the way they could. An ICBM or a nuclear test could invite or would invite even more sanctions on North Korea. So it would further delay the goal of potentially having sanctions relief. So I think for North Korea, it's easy to target South Korea, or easier to target South Korea, because I agree with my two fellow panelists. There's little that President Moon can actually do. He can wait until November, but he's not going to do much. He just have to take the hit, and he will take it, actually.
Forget November. What's going to happen on Thursday again when there's that 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War?
I mean, I would expect North Korea to continue to ramp up to ramp up tensions throughout the week, right? There is talk about potentially a military parade. We don't know if this is going to happen or not, because some of the last military parades have actually been canceled or postponed, and because we do have coronavirus in North out of North Korea saying the coronavirus has reached the country. But I would expect not a major provocation to take place. I don't think we're going to go back to test, for example, anytime soon. Not that they won't happen. They can happen in the next few weeks. But I don't think North Korea is ready enough for that right now. So I would expect some of the other tensions that have been mentioned before. Leaflets, obviously. Soldiers maybe moving to the DM set. North Korea has strongly suggested that this could actually be happening. We have seen loudspeakers on the North Korean side of the inter-Korean border coming up as well, so more propaganda messages from North Korea to South Korea.
Said that if they use drones when they do those pamphlet drops, that those might be shot down. Is that true?
I wouldn't be surprised, because North Korea has done it in the past, right? So in the past, when they wanted to shoot down some of the balloons, drones that have been used to send the leaflets to North Korea, this has happened. So it could happen again.
In the other direction.
So if South Korean leaflets were to be sent to North Korea,
North Korean
South Korea could do it as well. Yes, they could do it as well. It is true, though, that there's the environmental aspect that was mentioned before, but there's also the aspect that South Korea doesn't want to raise tensions unnecessarily. They could do it. South Korean military could do it if it wanted, without any major problem. But that will be a political decision, really. The capability is there. But the Blue House, President Moon, might say, well, this is not the time to do it, not to continue to increase tensions.
Yeah, now, getting back to what we were talking about at the outset, who are these North Korean defectors?
They tend to be, I think, to my knowledge, they're groups of North Korean defectors who work for charities, NGOs, where they send sometimes bottles of rice, messages, USB clips that I mentioned before of South Korean media, and cultural items like TV shows, etc., across the border in a bid to, send a message to people who they see are trapped on north of the 38th parallel. That said, they've been criticized strongly by the progressives in South Korea for a while now for their actions. The progressive government sees them as creating unnecessary tension, creating an atmosphere that is not good for not prosperous for talks with North Korea.
But they can't shut them down.
It's very difficult in a democracy like South Korea to forcibly shut them down. They've been trying. They're saying, attention, they're saying warnings, it's very dangerous, please stop doing it. And some groups have agreed to not do it this week, but others say they're going to do it on the anniversary, on the 25th of June.
Harry Kazianis, you heard Ramon Pacheco Pardo mention there could be a parade. I know that because it's such a reclusive regime in North Korea, one of the ways we watch is to see what the messaging is out of Pyongyang. How much can you glean from that messaging? Remember all those rumors back in April that something untold had happened to the leader, Kim Jong-un, and then he reappeared in public and was seemingly okay?
North Korea is fascinating because it makes analysts like us who dedicate our whole life to this, go to school, get PhDs, master's degrees, many times make us look like fools. But that's okay. I mean, this is what North Korea has done to the best of us. I mean, go back to Christmas time of last year when the North Koreans said they were going to send a Christmas package to Donald Trump. Many of us, including myself, thought that sounded like an ICBM test. Never materialized. We're probably never going to know why. But the North Koreans, I have to admit, many times do give us signals of things they are going to do. If you go back, say, to 2017, the North Koreans did tell us that they were going to test an ICBM. Guess what? They did it. There's been a lot of instances like this where the North Koreans try to signal to us things that they're going to do. The challenge in all of that, though, is they mix these statements into propaganda messages that make it very, very difficult to separate what's reality, what's coming, and what's fictional. So
here in the West, Harry, we've been focusing more and more on Kim's younger sister, Kim Yo Jong. Who's calling the shots right now in Pyongyang?
You know, I mean, at this point, I still think it is Kim Jong Un. I think it's very clear that Kim does have some sort of health issue. I mean, let's face it, he's 5'6", he's 300 pounds. Obviously, he suffers from obesity. He's a chain smoker. We can see that in the pictures. There's been rumors that he's had, heart issues, high blood pressure, hypertension. So when you have that, sheer amount of health issues that you're facing, obviously he's going to have something wrong with him. So I think the question is, how much control does he have? And I think it's very interesting that his sister is now sort of being brought to the forefront with being involved in all these messages. Now the point person for inter-Korean relations, they're grooming her. The question is, what are they grooming for her for? And I think we're going to find out.
And who's they, the ones that are grooming her?
I mean, I think her brother more than anything else. I mean, I think for him, his goal is obviously to keep the Kim family line in power in North Korea. So the best way to do that is he has to look at who are the available options to him. So obviously, his best option is his sister, who's been the closest to him, his closest confidant. I mean, every picture you see of him in all the various summits with Donald Trump, she's right there with him. Sometimes as a secretary, sometimes as the person picking up his cigarette butts, sometimes the person who's briefing him. So she's this sort of jack of all trades. And it seems like that is the person he trusts the most.
We've been paying Ramon Pacheco Pardo much more attention to her in the last weeks. But is her role the same as it's been throughout?
I think she's been groomed, as Harry said, and I think her role has been strengthened within the regime. We have seen how now she has a stronger position within the Politburo. She has clearly been portrayed in the media as the person calling the shots when it comes to relations with South Korea. This I find interesting. It seems that Kim Jong Un is focusing more on the US when it comes to taking decisions. So now we have Kim Yo Jong. We are being told she's the one that's directing all these increasing tensions with South Korea. And of course, she's the one who came to the Pyeongchang Olympics in 2018. When this process of diplomacy throughout 2018, 2019 was kickstarted. And now she's taking the opposite approach, which is being tough on South Korea. I do think that obviously we don't know what's happening with the health of Kim Jong-un, but I think that regardless of his health state, I do think that she is more powerful with the regime than she was a few months ago, because otherwise she wouldn't be portrayed in the media in the way she is. And she is a Kim, so after all, bloodline matters a lot, obviously. In North Korea, the country is based on the Kim bloodline, and she has it. So she has something that no other North Korean leader besides her sister actually has. So I do think she's going to become a more important member of the North Korean policymaking process. She's already there, but probably she's going to gain even more power in weeks and months to come.
Even more power? Could North Korea have a female leader?
Why not? I mean, at the end of the day, we focus on obviously the exec system that within North Korea, and it is there and it cannot be denied. But I think far more important is the bloodline, and her grandfather, essentially Kim Il-sung, essentially he's the one who created the country, right? And the country is to a large extent about glorifying the Kims. So I think that being female in this case, it wouldn't be a disadvantage for her because of who her grandfather, father, and brother are.
Yenali, is that the perception in South Korea, that bloodline matters more than gender?
It's difficult to say. I think it's far too early to speak of successor of anything of any sort. But Kim Yo Jong, it's not just the fact that she's a woman, it's also the fact that she's very young. I do agree with Ramon that bloodline perhaps is more important in this case, especially with the Kim family. That said, there are issues. She is very young. She doesn't have military titles. All these things do matter in North Korean leadership.
And what's the perception of her in South Korea?
To be honest, I think there's been quite a lot of unnecessary media coverage of her, in the sense where South Korean media, some of it had indulged in some kind of sexist view of her, looking at the clothes she's wearing, looking at how she's walking. All of this really doesn't interest anyone, I think. There's also been legitimate interest in her as a power player in North Korea, and I think observers in South Korea are very keen to find out what kind of role she'll have, especially because, as your panelist said earlier, she's been very active with the inter-Korean meetings.
That brings us to another topic of those, when you talk about those inter-Korean meetings. Harry Kazianis, we're hearing here in Paris that there's a book launch or something taking place on Tuesday where you are?
Yeah, not at all. Well, if you're referring to the John Bolton memoir, it's been circulating probably for almost a week now. I have a copy, and I've been sort of reading through it very diligently. And it's very tough to tell, obviously, how truthful this book is, how much John Bolton's trying to make that final big tranche of money. I mean, he's 71 years old. I also think too, a lot of this is politically motivated. John Bolton was never a hardcore Trump supporter. He was never a never Trumper. He never signed any of the letters back in 2016 denouncing Trump, but he was never on sort of the Trump train, so to speak. To be honest with you, it's very hard to know whether everything he's saying is factually accurate. A lot of people within the administration, people I know, have denounced large sections of the book as fictional. So I think it's really up to the reader to decide whether the parts about North Korea are true or not. I do know this, though. If I'm in Pyongyang and I'm reading it, and I'm hearing all these different reports that Donald Trump sort of used North Korea as a media ploy, a way to get a victory lap, a way to increase his poll numbers, I'm not exactly going to really feel that confident in dealing with Donald Trump.
But they're not naive in the North. They've been hearing that since the first summit in Singapore.
They have, but I think to hear it from a top national security advisor like a John Bolton, and to hear it all laid out once they get their copy, to see what Bolton says in terms of how far Trump was willing to go to make this a spectacle. I mean, Bolton has a section in there talking about the very first summit, how Trump wanted to sign a very bland communique, no substance whatsoever. The North Koreans took that communique in Singapore as if they were resetting relations. And to think that Donald Trump was basically lying to them, it's going to make them, I think, very weary about dealing with Donald Trump in the future if he's reelected.
And that book, by the way, doesn't just set its sights on Kim and on Donald Trump. It also sets its sights on South Korea. There's one excerpt in the book by the former national security advisor of Donald Trump where he says, quote, "The whole diplomatic fandango was South Korea's creation, relating more to its unification agenda than to serious strategy on Kim's part or ours." Well, that's drawn a sharp reaction from Blue House, from the South Korean presidency, with one spokesperson quoted by the French news agency AFP in reaction to Bolton's claim that Moon Jae-in, the South Korean president, is schizophrenic, saying it is an issue Bolton has to judge for himself. I think he might be one being a schizophrenic. Ramon Pacheco Pardo, your thoughts on Bolton gunning for Moon Jae-in?
I'm not surprised, to be completely honest, because, I mean, first of all, I mean, it is true that from Moon's perspective, his main objective is inter-Korean reconciliation, and he sees diplomacy as a way to get there. He also thinks that this can help with denuclearization. But obviously, this is very different from the Bolton approach, or the approach that many have in the US, which is denuclearization comes first, and then we can start to talk about some other matters, including, for example, better economic relations between both Koreas, reconciliation, etc., etc. Now, having said that, even if that is the goal of the South Korean government, and I think it is, you wouldn't want anyone saying, well, this is what you want to do, you don't care about denuclearization, because, I mean, particularly, I think that this South Korean liberal government, even though it wants reconciliation between both Koreas, it also wants North Korea to take steps towards denuclearization in a way that maybe previous South Korean administrations were not so focused on, because North Korea's nuclear program was not as developed. So I think what we have to consider as well is that we don't have a agreement with a single goal, but in terms of priorities, I would agree. Reconciliation comes first, and denuclearization comes second for the current South Korean government.
And that the hawks in Washington don't like it. It seems, reading those excerpts from John Bolton's book. When you were there back in February, did you get the sense that Moon Jae-in had a bigger problem when it came to Pyongyang or when it came to Washington?
Well, I think by then, to be honest, it probably was more Washington, because there were many other things on the discussion table, right? There is, of course, the new agreement, how much does South Korea have to pay for American troops to be stationed in the country. There had also been a trade war last year, which is not over from a South Korean perspective. At some point, tariffs could be imposed on South Korean products. So there are many different issues that raise, I wouldn't say tensions, but differences between South Korea and the United States. And back then, even though the signs coming out of Pyongyang were not positive, we didn't have the tensions that we have right now. So I think you could see how South Korea understood, the Blue House, MOFA, understood that the relationship obviously wasn't as good as it was last year. But I think they didn't expect for things to blow up in the way they have done over the past few days and weeks.
After Moon Jae-in's predecessor left under the shroud of a corruption scandal, she was a hawk, he's more of a dove. Yenna Lee, how has that relationship with Washington evolved?
I think it's quite interesting to see how during the 2018 and 2019 détente period, Moon Jae-in really positioned himself as the mediator between Washington and Pyongyang, and he was lauded for it. People in the media, observers, were saying he's doing a great job. At least he's doing what his policy, he's carrying it out, he's trying his best. But now it looks like both sides don't see him as that useful anymore. It seems like, as we said earlier, Moon Jae-in's failed at delivering any sort of sanctions relief for Kim, and he's also failed at delivering any sort of denuclearization for Trump.
And so his position at home, is it weakened as a result?
I think a lot of his fans and his supporters here in South Korea place the blame solely on the feet of Washington and the White House for what's happened, for not being lenient enough about the sanctions. His supporters will always say that it's the US that got in the way of inter-Korean détente.
Harry Kazianis, you said earlier you could spend a lifetime studying the Koreas. And again, we're coming up to that Thursday 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. Is always this stalemate. It seems to always be the same cycle. Warming of relations, then rising of tensions, then cooling of tensions, then rising of tensions. Is that like Sisyphus climbing the mountain, the fate of Korea forever?
Look, it doesn't have to be. I mean, I'll be very honest with you. I used to be one of those in the John Bolton camp who was very hard line, saw that denuclearization had to come first before there can be any progress. Look, the bottom line is North Korea is a nuclear weapons state. They might have as many as 20, 25 nuclear weapons. They're close to having an ICBM that can hit the United States. We have to deal with those realities as they are, even though we don't like them. So the way out of this trap, at least from my perspective, is I think the United States has to change its approach. I think the only way, if you're going to try to get the North Koreans to give up some sliver of their nuclear program, is I think you have to be able to be willing to give some things. I think if you're wanting to gain some trust, which the North Koreans always scream about, I think you're going to have to do things like end the Korean War. I think you're going to have to open liaison offices. I think you're going to have to enter into arms control before you start talking about full-fledged denuclearization. If we keep hinging to the Bolton model, if you will, or the Libya model, that the North Koreans have to hand over all their nuclear weapons within 6 months or a year, or whatever crazy thing he said, we're going to keep going through this over and over again. And as somebody,
so you're resigned to North Korea being a nuclear power.
They are a nuclear power. And you know what, the thing is, I'm not in government right now, so it's easy for me to say that. But to be Donald Trump to say that, or a Bolton or a Robert O'Brien, the current national security advisor, I mean, that puts yourself at political risk. But I think a lot of people understand that it's going to be very hard to have irreversible denuclearization. Now, I wish we could create the incentives for the North Koreans to do that. But look, the North Koreans are smart. They look at history and they understand that the United States does not invoke regime change on countries that have nuclear weapons. It's the ultimate insurance guarantee. So if I'm sitting in the White House right now, I'm going to be a pragmatist and say, my number one priority is China in Asia as opposed to North Korea. And I'm going to do everything I can to lower those risks on the Korean Peninsula and try to give Moon Jae-in a little bit more maneuvering room to try and bring Kim Jong Un in the fold. Now, maybe it all falls in its face. It's very, very possible. But I think that's the one thing we haven't actually tried yet that might actually work.
And would a President Biden try it?
No, absolutely not. I mean, Joe Biden, the advisors that he would bring in, they're all very good people, very smart. I know many of them, but they are very much of the, I don't want to say the Bolton mindset, but of this idea that the North Koreans have to make big changes in terms of giving up nuclear weapons, declaring their nuclear fissile materials production facilities before they'll do anything. Before, some of them actually won't even do anything until they actually give a lot of that stuff up. So if it's a Biden administration, I think we're back to a potential fire and fury scenario.
Wow. Ramon Pacheco Pardo, you agree?
Obviously, I don't live in Washington, D.C., so I think Harry knows the domestic dynamics better than I do. I mean, I think there are two things here. One thing that I find interesting is that in private, not in public, but in private, North Korea, when he talked about the U.S., it was all about Trump. In 2019, after Hanoi, the talk in private again was about the U.S. How can we deal with the United States, knowing that Trump might win the second term, but he might not win a second term? I think they will clinch to this line from Biden last week when he talked about principled diplomacy. I think that's how he called it. I think the North Koreans in private, again, they realize that they're never going to have it so good with a U.S. president as they have it with Trump, who is willing to go straight to the top, but they're willing to engage with whoever comes after Trump, either this year or in 5 years' time. And there's a second aspect here, which I think both my counterparts mentioned. What about South Korea? One of the interesting things that I think we can all agree is that Trump doesn't care about allies. Now, one thing that you see coming out of the Blue House and you see coming out from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in South Korea is that they think that they could work with a U.S. president who cares about the U.S.-South Korea alliance. Meaning that if Biden comes to power and he says, well, North Korea has to do A, B, C, and D, and by the way, we also have to discuss human rights, I think many in South Korea feel that at least they would know what type of policy this president is going to follow, and that they would be able to work with the president and his people to try to have some sort of dialogue or at least engagement with South Korea. And I think many in the Blue House especially, they're a little bit frustrated with what has happened since Hanoi, since the Hanoi summit, because there has really been no diplomacy, right? And they feel that there should be some degree of diplomacy, even if there are big differences between South Korea, North Korea, and the United States on how to move forward the next steps.
At the end of the day, Koreans won't influence who wins or loses the next U.S. presidential election in November. But will Korean culture have an impact? We saw this tweet from progressive Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying, K-pop allies, we see and appreciate your contributions in the fight for justice too. That's because K-pop fans banded together and reserved a lot of seats at that Trump rally that took place in Oklahoma over the weekend, leaving him with egg on his face because the auditorium was not filled the way he had predicted. Yenna-Lee, what is it with K-pop? Explain.
Well, I think we've learnt, I think we've all learnt by now that K-pop fans are a force to be reckoned with. I think there are upwards of 90 million K-pop fans around the world. That's the size of a pretty big country. And when they mobilize, they're super tech savvy, they're super social media savvy, they can mobilize an entire cause. I've been following... Oh, well, I've been following a K-pop reporter, a pop culture reporter who works for the Korean Herald, and he says that where K-pop might be in South Korea, just mainstream culture, mainstream music, when it's abroad, it's a part of a subculture, which might explain why they're so interested in progressive causes, and in this case, why they're so anti-Trump.
Harry Kazianis, I got to confess, watching it from afar, just music and good performances. It didn't seem to be very political K-pop to me.
No, to be honest with you, this is kind of interesting. I think this sort of took the Trump administration by surprise. I don't think they expected this at all. And the reports we're having here that 800,000, 1 million people wanted to get into this rally. It always seems sort of strange because this was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, not New York City or Boston or Washington, D.C. So a lot of people were sort of questioning on the sidelines, how can they get this much demand? Were people coming in from other states? I mean, that's always possible. But I think now we have an understanding of why this happened.
What does it tell you, the fact that, K-pop, by the way, it's not just in this particular instance, they've done it before, K-pop fans. As Jaein was saying, it means different things whether you're inside South Korea or outside of it.
Sure. I mean, I think it's fascinating to see how much this musical genre has really bloomed over the last couple of years. But broaden it out for a second. Look at the soft power of just South Korea in general. I mean, I walk into any electronics store today here in the United States, at least when I could, and it's blossoming with Samsung and LG, beautiful QLED and OLED TVs. I go driving around Washington, D.C., I see Hyundai and Kias. I see luxury Genesis cars. I mean, so it's not just the rise of K-pop, but in many instances, the rise of South Korea into becoming a first world economic power.
Because 2 years ago, Ramon Pacheco Pardo, when we had that big scandal surrounding the South Korean conglomerates, there was talk, oh yeah, they're not becoming a first world power. It's a house of cards. That's not true, though.
I don't think so. And I think you see it with culture, right? And you see bands like BTS, the lyrics, they talk about youth unemployment, for example. They talk about the alienation of young people. And this resonates with many young people across the world. You have someone like Blackpink, they talk about feminist issues, right? Female empowerment. So they're talking about these type of things that resonate beyond South Korea and clearly have a global audience. I think that maybe coming from Europe, our perspective might be different that coming from the United States, because obviously the United States has a strong security relationship with South Korea, the alliance, that we don't have in Europe. And maybe we look at other issues as well. And it is true that a few years ago, I could see it in my class, more and more young kids here in Europe, they were talking about K-pop, they were talking about K-dramas, and they were talking about movies, for example, in a way that you wouldn't read in a textbook, because this is something that we're starting to see in textbooks now. But for young people who were following this on YouTube, on other social media, they were doing it outside of the mainstream media, so to speak, and they knew about these things. So I think this is actually empowering South Korea. And what I find interesting is that many of these young people, the way they approach Northeast Asia, inter-Korean relations, South Korea is very different, right? So they do understand this thirst for reconciliation that some 60-70% of South Koreans actually have. For example, many young kids from Central Eastern Europe, they understand where this comes from, right? Because they were on the other side of the curtain, so to speak. And this somehow changes the conversation. I don't think it has affected policymakers yet, but as new generations come to power, this could actually reframe how we see the Korean Peninsula and South Korea and inter-Korean relations.
All these years later, Ramon, we know how much Western pop music played an influence the other side of the Iron Curtain before 1989. Again, could K-pop bring down the wall between North and South Korea?
Well, what I find interesting, and I'm not an expert on North Korean refugees living in South Korea, but I have done some interviews. And some of the younger refugees who left North Korea, they didn't necessarily do so because they wanted a better life in South Korea, but because they actually saw something like K-pop and they wanted to become K-pop stars. So there is an academy in South Korea that is training potential future K-pop stars, and you have North Korean refugees who are actually being trained there. So they didn't leave North Korea because of the oppression of the regime itself, but because they say, hey, I want to become the next BTS, for example. So there is some change on the ground taking place in North Korea that obviously we can only get a glimpse of, right? But this is to an extent, as you were saying, because of K-pop and because of South Korean culture.
Yeah, and you've mentioned this before, Jaein, how there's that difference of perception according to what generation you're from when you look at the relations on the peninsula.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also very interesting to note that Moon Jae-in's generation this generation of progressive politicians, they all come from the moment when South Korea, there were students when South Korea was transitioning into a democracy. They're the students who fought for democracy. And now their kids are Generation Z. And I think there's a strong link between that generation and the values they've passed on to their children who are today's Generation Z in Korea.
We'll leave it there for now. Yenna Lee, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank as well Harry Kazianis for being with us from Washington, D.C., Ramon Pacheco Pardo in London. We want to thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. There's much more on our website, france24.com, as well as Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube channel. Bye for now.
Sur France 24, la nuit, on est très fiers d'accompagner les Amériques dans leurs soirées, de voir l'Asie se réveiller, et on est là jusqu'à ce que Paris s'éveille.
France 24 es más que solo noticias. Es libertad, igualdad y actualidad. Nosotros damos un paso más allá, con información al momento para analizar, comprender, poner en perspectiva y debatir.
In Live from Paris, our correspondents around the world keep you up to date.
من الطبيعي أن يكون شعارها الحرية وخاصة حرية التعبير في بلد حرية التعبير.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Haile Selassie, the last emperor of Ethiopia, considered as the Black Messiah by the Rastafari, who died in 1975, has left a deep impression on his country.
Les relations internationales et relations africaines sous la direction de l'empereur, c'était vraiment remarquable.
If the Negus was the inspiration behind the African Union, which since his reign has been based in Addis Ababa and which regularly pays homage to him, he has also left a darker legacy. Between his supporters and those who fear the return of an autocratic regime, Haile Selassie's legacy remains divisive. Don't miss the Negus Empire Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.